Are back again once more. I'm hoping that the microphone is up loud enough that you can hear me. Okay, let me see. You'll just have to tell me if you can hear me or not. So, we are on Mountains of Spices by Hannah Hurnard, and this is chapter 3, entitled Gloomy and Spiteful. These are Mrs. Dismal Foreboding's daughters. So, here we go. Bitterness and his wife Murmuring were the proprietors of the village inn at Much Trembling. It was a picturesque, many-gabled building standing among shady trees on a corner of the village green. On one side of the inn was a bowling lawn, and on the other side was a pleasant tea garden lying along the bank of the river where there were boats for hire. The bar room was clean, freshly painted, and comfortable, an attractive meeting place for all the village cronies. Farmers from all over the valley gathered at Much Trembling Inn on market days, and Bitterness and his wife not only had a very prosperous business, but they prided themselves on running it very respectably. Indeed, as a comfortable, up-to-date hotel, patronized by all the best people, including old Lord Fearing himself, who often gathered there with his friends in the private parlor. Timid Skulking, nicknamed Moody, a younger brother of Mrs. Murmuring, also lived at the inn and helped in the work. He had married Mrs. Dismal Foreboding's daughter, Spiteful. But the marriage had turned out most unhappily, for Moody had the reputation of possessing the quickest and most uncertain temper in the village, and his wife, poor girl, the sharpest tongue. Only a short time before Grace and Glory returned to the valley, Moody had been sentenced to a term in prison for almost beating his young wife to death while he was under the influence of drink, and this just at a time when the whole village was already gossiping about Sir Coward Fearing's desertion of his wife, Gloomy, who was Spiteful's sister. When she was first married, the Honorable Mrs. Coward Fearing had not often condescended to visit Spiteful at the village inn, but since the tragedy of her husband's desertion, a common bond of misery and sorrow seemed to have drawn her to her sister, and had worked a great change in the haughty Gloomy. Every day since her sister's illness, she had gone furtively and as secretly as possible to the attic to do what she could do for her. Help and comfort. Outwardly, perhaps, that was not very much, for Gloomy had always despised housework, and knew very little indeed about cleaning a room, cooking, or nursing. She had little spoken comfort to give either. She did everything in a silent, dreary way, even gloomier than her name. But even so, her daily visits were the one bright spot, if such could be called, in her sister's miserable existence. The feeling that one person at least in the world cared to be with her was like an anchor to the soul of the poor, forlorn girl. Mrs. Dismal Forebodings herself was so overcome by the humiliations and disgrace which had befallen the family that she could not be persuaded to leave her own cottage and meet the curious or pitying stares of the neighbors, though she did prepare and send along little bits of meals, soups or broth, or eggs or whatever she could spare. Gloomy certainly had no more desire than her mother to face the stares of the neighbors. But, nevertheless, day by day, at a time when the streets were most deserted, she made her way to the attic, where she then spent most of the day. It seemed almost as though she found some slight solace for her own misery in trying to help the even deeper misery of her sister. They never spoke much together, but sometimes, when poor Spiteful, overcome by weakness and exhaustion, broke into anguished tears, Gloomy would sit beside her, awkwardly holding her hand. None of the Dismal Forebodings knew how to express sympathy and affection, though speaking not a word. It was the best that she could do, and more than Gloomy herself ever realized, she did lighten and ease her sister's sorrow. On this particular morning, after washing up the 2 cracked plates and cups and saucers, Gloomy swept the floor, dusted the few bits of furniture, and then, taking her work-bag, she sat down by the side of her sister and began silently to help with the sewing. A huge basket of mending stood on the floor between them. Mrs. Bitterness was determined that Spiteful should help as much as possible, even during her convalescence, and she could no longer spend long hours in the kitchen washing up. Her work was now to do all the mending for the hotel. For some time the 2 sisters worked in silence, and then there came a light tap on the door. They looked at one another, startled and puzzled. Who could it be? Spiteful had shrunk pitifully from receiving visits from the neighbors, and murmuring had also discouraged them strongly. The sooner the miserable affair was hushed up and forgotten, the better. And if Spiteful kept out of sight and didn't talk, the more quickly would people forget. The knock on the door was repeated, and then, as no one in the room answered, the caller apparently decided upon entering without permission, for the door opened, and Grace and Glory stepped in to the room, followed by her 2 beautiful companions, Joy and Peace. At the sight of her cousin, Spiteful sank back in her seat and covered her face with her hands, as though to try to hide herself. Gloomy sat rigid and silent at her side, only making one slight involuntary movement as though to interpose her own form between that of the newcomer and her sister. Grace and Glory stepped forward and looked beseechingly at her cousins, and then, kneeling down beside Spiteful, put her arms around the shrinking figure and said softly, with the tears running down her face, "Oh, Spiteful, please, please do not turn from me. Do not let me be with you for just a little while. Oh, do let me be with you for just a little while. You don't know how often my heart has ached for you since I got back to the valley a few days ago and heard of your sorrow. And oh, I am so glad to find that Gloomy is here too. I have not seen either of you for such a long time. Do tell me that you are just a little pleased to see me and will let me stay." Neither sister spoke a word. But Spiteful suddenly burst into tears and laid her head against the shoulder of her kneeling cousin, as though at last the bitter anguish of her broken heart must find an outlet. For some time they continued like this, without a word being spoken, until finally the wild sobbing ceased, and Grace and Glory, taking her handkerchief, wiped this tear-stained face and kissed her cousin again and again. Then there came a little interruption. The two tall strangers, who all this while had remained unnoticed in the background, now came forward, saying sweetly, "Please come and refresh yourselves. We have made everything ready." Gloomy and Spiteful looked up in amazement, and then again shrank back as though in shame or embarrassment. The ugly, unpainted little table was now covered with a cloth. On it stood a vase in which were arranged some of the sweetest perfumed flowers that the sisters had ever seen, pure white with a golden crown at the heart of each one. Beside the vase of flowers were plates filled with wild strawberries and blueberries. Another dish held apricots, apples, and pomegranates, and there was a loaf of bread, a pat of butter, and a comb of fresh honey, delicacies which never before had appeared in that dreary attic, or in Mrs. Dismal's almost equally dreary cottage. It was enough to tempt the weakest appetite. Peace was over by the stove, pouring boiling water into the teapot, and Joy was holding a bottle of fresh milk in one hand and a little jug of cream in the other. Spiteful looked at her sister speechlessly, and Gloomy said, in a voice which tried to be a little like the old haughty tone, "We cannot accept charity like this. Much, and then she broke off as though she couldn't finish the name, and added almost tremblingly, "As though we were beggars, Grace and Glory." "Which is what we really are, though," added Spiteful. "This isn't charity," said Grace and Glory with a little laugh. "We picked these strawberries and blueberries up on the high places this morning before coming down to the valley. And the other fruits are out of the king's gardens, and the honey is from his hives. My dearest cousins, nobody thinks he is accepting charity when a king gives." The sisters looked at one another. Then Spiteful, who through all her illness and weakness had seen nothing whatever to tempt her appetite, looked longingly at the fresh fruits on the daintily spread table, and Gloomy saw the look. She got up, and taking her sister's hand, said simply, "Thank you very much. Spiteful has been so weak and sick, it really would be the most absurd pride on our part to refuse, and as she says, no one has less right to be proud than we have." Then they all three sat down at the table, and Joy and Peace waited on them in the deftest and kindest manner possible. First, they cut the bread into enticingly thin slices. Then they served the strawberries and cream, and while those were being eaten, Joy prepared the pomegranates and apples, and Peace whipped up a nourishing and delicious concoction of eggs. As they ate the meal up there in the cheerless attic, Spiteful felt almost like a queen being coaxed with delicacies. A faint color stole into her cheeks, and a light appeared in her eyes. While they were eating, Grace and Glory described to them the places up on the mountains where the strawberries grew and the banks covered with blueberries, the pine woods with the lovely spicy smell of sun-warmed cones, the humming of the bees over the fields of flowers, and even a little bit about the king's gardens and the pomegranate trees in whose shade they had eaten their breakfast that very morning. She told them of the king's love for the pomegranates and the belief of the eastern peoples on the other side of the mountain. that no evil spirit can approach a pomegranate tree because it is the tree of life, of love. Then, little by little, Gloomy and Spiteful began to speak too, hesitatingly at first, asking questions. Gloomy wanted to know what the white golden-hearted flowers were in the center of the table, which gave forth the lovely perfume. She had never seen such flowers before. Grace and Glory blushed a little as she answered that they were the flowers of love, which grow up on the high places. But she did not add that she had picked those particular blooms from the tree which the shepherd had planted in her own heart. Then they wanted to know about her journey, but Grace and Glory did not seem able to say much about that, only to speak of the shepherd's goodness and to help, and over again speak of the shepherd himself. By the time the delicious little picnic meal was ended, the three cousins were talking together with an ease and friendliness which they had never felt before. Stranger still, as Joy and Peace gathered up the remains of the repast and insisted on doing the washing up away in the background, something happened to Gloomy and Spiteful. They began, haltingly and in low voices, often breaking off as though unable to continue, to speak about their own sorrows. Somehow, even the names of Coward Fearing, Moody, and Craven Fear passed their lips. Poor Spiteful even murmuring excuses for her husband. It was noticeable that never once did she utter a word of blame. And Gloomy, with a dark, painful flush on her cheeks, muttered something about her own cold, haughty attitude and her unfitness for marriage, unable as she was to win and keep her husband's love. Then Grace and Glory, also hesitatingly, told them of her own experience of the plant in her heart which she had supposed to be love, only to find that it was selfish, possessive love, and the longing to be loved, and of all the anguish it had caused her until, away up there on the mountains, it had been wrenched out of her heart altogether. She told them also of her two companions, Sorrow and Suffering, and how, up on the high places, they had actually been transformed into joy and peace. And the two handmaidens, hearing their names mentioned, looked around and smiled radiantly. As she spoke, it seemed that in some miraculous way the stuffy, miserable attic had expanded and changed, and they were sitting out on the mountainside, and the fir trees roofing them overhead, the fresh mountain air blowing around them, and the snowy peaks shining above, and the voice of the great waterfall sounding in their ears as it leaped down, singing to the valleys below. Then Grace and Glory sang to them another of the songs which she had learned on the mountain of pomegranates. Oh, holy love! Oh, burning flame! Why should I longer roam? Forth from the heart of God I came, and yearn to go back to my home. Send forth thy truth, O shining light, that I may follow till I come at last before the night up to thy holy hill. For there my soul longs to abide within the holy place, and when the veil is drawn aside, to see my Father's face. O thou from whom my spirit came, and wanders in this wild, behold, I bear thy lovely name. Lead home thy wandering child. As she finished singing, there came another knock on the door, low but quite clear. Gloomy and Spiteful again started and looked at one another questioningly, and then at Grace and Glory. A lovely color had flooded into her cheeks, and her eyes shone like stars. She knew in an instant whose hand it was that knocked on the door of that dismal attic. As her two cousins stared at her speechlessly, the knock came again, a little louder, a little more insistent. "Oh," entreated Grace and Glory, "oh, spiteful and gloomy, it is he whom we have been talking about. It is the shepherd himself. Open the door and tell him to come in." Every drop of blood seemed to drain away from Spiteful's already pallid cheeks. She shrank back, casting a stricken look around the wretched room and at her own ragged clothes, which scarcely covered the bruises on her body. She cringed backwards, covering her face with her hands. For a minute there was dead silence, so complete it seemed as though the beating of every heart in the room must become audible. Then through the silence there came a third knock, and a man's strong, gentle, patient voice was heard saying, "May I come in?" Gloomy rose to her feet. She was trembling from head to foot, but she touched her sister's arm and pointed wordlessly and entreatingly towards the door. Then poor Spiteful, the sorrowful, destitute owner of the miserable attic, stumbled across the room and opened the door. The shepherd stepped inside, tall, powerful, with regal mien, and yet with a look of infinite compassion on his face. Spiteful looked at him just once, and then cast herself full length on the ground at his feet with a bitter cry of anguish, saying, "Lord, have pity on me." He put out his hand to lift her up, but before he could do so or speak a word, there was Gloomy, the one-time haughty daughter-in-law of Lord Fearing, kneeling at his feet beside her sister, whispering through trembling lips, "Have mercy on me also, Lord. Don't leave me outside thy grace." As he raised them both together with words of love and compassion, the look on the shepherd's face was that of one who at last has achieved his heart's desire, of the Savior who knows that now he may begin the heavenly work of saving. Grace and Glory, with joy and peace standing beside her, looked on and said in her heart, "No, not even up on the high places have we known such joy as this. This attic is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." Genesis 28:17. And that is the end of this chapter. Until next time, remember to be still and know that He is God.